So, Jason, with Brent Venables assembling a coaching staff, where do we stand there? What work has yet to be done?
Yeah, so the coaching staff by and large is set. There's two positions that are remaining, which would be the defensive line coach and in the defensive backs, particularly the cornerback. So Brandon Hall was probably the latest addition to the defensive staff, who will be a safeties coach, and he'll probably be one of the special teams coordinators. Who really, it's a big need for Oklahoma. Riley did not have that towards the last few years, and really didn't put a lot of focus on that side from a special teams perspective. So I think having that focus will be nice for Oklahoma, just kind of coming into the next few seasons. So really, from what I've been hearing, Mark, there's about four names, two on each side. One of the things that I've heard is kind of the holdup was that a few of these guys that were possibilities were still coaching in the playoffs. And so three of the four names that I've kind of heard been floating around are absolutely still in the playoffs. So from the defensive line side, Todd Bates continues to be a name that I hear a lot about. Great recruiter from Clemson, defensive line coach. He's a guy that's still in the mix. But the other guy that I've heard in the mix is Trey Scott. Trey Scott is the defensive line coach at the University of Georgia right now. So those are the two guys that I hear more than anything. On the defensive line side and the cornerback side, those are going to be two coaches that are currently with Georgia and Alabama. So Jamil Adai is a guy that I've heard, as well as Jay Valai from the Alabama side. Those are the two guys. I think one of the things coming into this, Mark, was interesting. Would Oklahoma do what they needed to do from a financial perspective, just to be willing to spend the money that's needed to bring some of these guys in? Some of those guys aren't going to be cheap. Specifically, a guy like Valai, I think, he's upwards of $800,000-$900,000 from a positional coach from the Alabama perspective. But it seems like Oklahoma is all in on doing whatever they need to do, not only to be successful on the field here next year, but position themselves in a good way for the SEC. And I think they've got a good mix. We thought that this might be the case, and it's really turning out to be this way, Mark, that Oklahoma is looking, and Venables specifically is looking at bringing a mix of guys that he knows and he's comfortable with, whether it be at Clemson or whether it be guys that he previously worked with along the way, either at Oklahoma or at Clemson, and a mix of guys that have SEC experience. So if that ends up being the case at the defensive line position and the cornerbacks position as well, that will be obviously a big value add for Oklahoma going into the SEC.
Now, Brandon Hall spent quite a bit of time at Oklahoma, so that's where he got to start. Student assistant, graduate assistant, a defensive assistant in 04 and 05, so he hasn't been on campus. Well, then he popped up in 2011, so he came back in 2011 for 1 year as a defensive quality coach. A lot of stops to the FCS level, a bit of high school experience, and then once he got back from Oklahoma in 2011, Arkansas State, Auburn, Jacksonville State, Troy in particular, where he spent the bulk of his time since 2018. So 4 seasons at Troy most recently before coming back to Oklahoma. So he knows Oklahoma football through and through, no question about that.
Yeah, no, and I think, like I said, there's an interesting mix. You've got Miguel Chavis, who has been brought on. He was a quality assistant. He was an off-field guy for Venables at Clemson, who's coming over. That will certainly be a guy that Clemson people feel like it's a tough blow. And I think another guy that was really kind of behind the scenes. I think his name is Thad Turner-Speed, who is a guy he was really Dabo's right hand man from a kind of a player player control person, and he was at Alabama previously. And really, I think he's a guy that's going to work behind the scenes a lot. I think he was a director of the director of kind of player personnel for Alabama, then the Clemson, now Oklahoma. So that's a valuable guy as well. So this mix of guys that he's comfortable with, whether it be guys that currently were on the offensive staff already, that have just done a really good job, like Cale Gundy, Bill Bedenbaugh, DeMarco Murray, Joe John Finley's a few guys, and then bringing in a guy that like Jeff Levy, with the experience that he has on the offensive side of the ball, not to mention, the SEC side. So it's an interesting, I think it's a very diverse staff when you talk about some of the guys that have been with Oklahoma for quite some time, and then you talk about some of the guys that Venables trust, whether it be guys that he's had with him, at Clemson, guys that he has had with him, whether it be an on-field or off-the-field role at Oklahoma, as you mentioned, with Brandon Hall, and then some of these guys that bring in just a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of coaching experience from the SEC. So I think it's shaping up to be a very good staff that most people will be excited about. I think the one thing that the jury's I think the one hire that the jury maybe still a little bit out was a little bit, maybe not concerning, but question, just the thought process was Ted Roof from a defensive coordinator perspective. So I think, some of the things that I know and I've heard is what Bob Stoops did when he was initially here. He had a big control over the defense. He even called some of the plays early on, and I think Venables is more than likely going to kind of take that same role early on, and being a little bit more hands-on than you would normally expect. And but from everything I've heard, Ted Roof is an outstanding recruiter who has ties really all across the country with his all the stops that he's made along the ACC and the SEC. So I think I would expect it maybe be more of a defensive coordinator in name only, and more of an assistant, at least early on, being Venables' eyes up in the press box.